Section 21 of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 10. Modes of the Moment, a Fashion Article, Part 2. Nothing daunted by this, I looked up the address of a sporting tailor in a side street off Regent Street, whose genius was reputed to find an artistic outlet in knee breeches. Before visiting his shop I disclosed my purpose to my travelling companion, an individual in whose judgment and good taste I have ordinarily every confidence, and who has a way of coming directly to the meat of a subject. "What do you want with a pair of knee breeches?" inquired this person crisply. "Why, for general sporting occasions," I replied. "For instance, what occasions?" "For golfing," I said, "and for riding, you know, and if I should go west next year they would come in very handy for the shooting." "To begin with," said my companion, "you do not golf. The only extensive riding I have ever heard of your doing was on railway trains. And if these knee breeches you contemplate buying are anything like the knee breeches I have seen here in London, and if you should wear them out west among the impulsive western people, there would undoubtedly be a good deal of shooting, but I doubt whether you would enjoy it. They might hit you." "Look here," I said, "every man in America who wears duck pants doesn't run a poultry farm. And the presence of a sailor hat in the summer time does not necessarily imply that the man under it owns a yacht. I cannot go back home to New York and face other and older members of the When I Was in London Club without some sartorial credentials to show for my trip. I am firmly committed to this undertaking. Do not seek to dissuade me, I beg of you. My mind is set on knee breeches, and I shan't be happy until I get them." So saying, I betook myself to the establishment of this sporting tailor in the side street off Regent Street, and there, without much difficulty, I formed the acquaintance of a salesman of suave and urbane manners. With his assistance I picked out a distinctive, not to say striking, pattern in an effect of plaids. The goods, he said, were made of the wool of a Scotch sheep in the natural colours. They must have some pretty fancy-looking sheep in Scotland. This done, the salesman turned me over to a cutter, who took me to a small room where incompleted garments were hanging all about like the quartered carcasses of animals in a butcher shop. The cutter was a person who dropped his H's and then, catching himself, gathered them all up again and put them back in his speech, in the wrong places. He surveyed me extensively with a square and a measuring line, meantime taking many notes, and told me to come back on the next day but one. On the day named, and at the hour appointed, I was back. He had the garments ready for me. As with an air of pride he elevated them for my inspection, they seemed commodious, indeed voluminous. I had told him when making them to take all the latitude he needed, but it looked now as though he had got it confused in his mind with longitude. Those breeches appeared to be constructed for cargo rather than speed. With some internal misgivings I lowered my person into them while he held them in position, and when I had descended as far as I could go without entirely immuring myself, he buttoned the dewdabs at the knees, then he went round behind me and cinched them in abruptly, so that of a sudden they became quite snug at the waistline. The only trouble was that the waistline had moved close up under my armpits, practically eliminating about 1.5 feet of me that I had always theretofore regarded as indispensable to the general effect. Right in the middle of my back, up between my shoulder blades, there was a stiff, hard clump of something that bored into my spine uncomfortably. I could feel it quite plainly, lumpy and rough. "How's that, sir?" he cheerily asked me over my shoulder, but it seemed to me there was a strained, nervous note in his voice. "A bit of all right, eh, sir?" "Well," I said, standing on tiptoe in an effect to see over the top, "you've certainly behaved very generously toward me, I'll say that much. Midships there appears to be about 4 or 5 yards of material I do not actually need in my business, being, as it happens, neither a harem favourite nor a professional sack racer. And they come up so high I'm afraid people will think the gallant coastguards have got me in a life buoy and are bringing me ashore through the surf." "You'll be wanting them a bit loose, sir, you know," he interjected, still snuggling close behind me. "All our gentlemen like them loose." "Oh, very well," I said. "Perhaps these things are mere details. However, I would be under deep obligations to you if you'd change 'em from barking tine to schooner rig, and lower away this gaff topsail which now sticks up under my chin, so that I can luff and come up in the wind without capsizing. And say, what is that hard lump between my shoulders?" "Nothing at all, sir," he said hastily, and now I knew he was flurried. "I can fix that, sir, in a jiffy, sir." "Anyhow, please come round here in the front where I can converse more freely with you on the subject," I said. I was becoming suspicious that all was not well with me back where he was lingering. He came reluctantly, still half embracing me with one arm. Petulantly I wrestled my form free, and instantly those breeches seemed to leap outward in all directions away from me. I grabbed for them, and barely in time I got a grip on the yawning top hem. Peering down the cave-like orifice that now confronted me, I beheld two spectral white columns, and recognized them as my own legs. In the same instant also I realized what that hard clump against my spine was, because when he took his hand away the clump was gone. He had been standing back there with some 8 or 9 inches of superfluous waistband bunched up in his fist. The situation was embarrassing, and it would have been still more embarrassing had I elected to go forth wearing my breeches in their then state, because to avoid talk he would have had to go along too, walking immediately behind me and holding up the slack. And such a spectacle, with me filling the tonneau and he back behind on the rumble, would have caused comment undoubtedly. The pants maker was up a stump. He looked reproachfully at me, chidingly at the breeches and sternly at the tape measure, which he wore draped round his neck like a pet snake, as though he felt convinced one of us was at fault, but he could not be sure which one. "I'm afraid, sir," he said, "that your figure is changing." "I guess you're right," I replied with a soft sigh. "As well as I can judge, I'm not as tall as I was day before yesterday, by at least 18 inches. And I've mislaid my diaphragm somewhere, haven't I?" "'Ave them off, please, sir," he said resignedly. "I'll 'ave to alter them to conform, sir. Come back tomorrow." I had them off, and he altered them to conform, and I went back on the morrow. In fact, I went back so often that after a while I became really quite attached to the place. I felt almost like a member of the firm. Between calls from me, the cutter worked on those breeches. He cut them up and he cut them down. He sheared the back away and shingled the front, and shifted the buttons to and fro. Still, even after all this, they were not what I should term an unqualified success. When I sat down in them they seemed to climb up so high on me, fore and aft, that I felt as short-waisted as a crush hat in a state of repose. And the only way I could get my hands into the hip pockets of those breeches was to take the breeches off first. As ear muffs they were fair, but as hip pockets they were failures. Finally, I told him to send my breeches, just as they were, to my hotel address, and I paid the bill. I brought them home with me. On the day after my arrival I took them to my regular tailor, and laid the case before him. I tried them on for him, and asked him to tell me, as man to man, whether anything could be done to make those garments habitable. He called his cutter into consultation, and they went over me carefully, meantime uttering those commiserating, clucking sounds one tailor always utters when examining another tailor's handiwork. After this my tailor took a lump of chalk and charted out a kind of Queen Rosamund's maze of cross marks on my breeches, and said I might leave them, and that if surgery could save them he would operate. At any rate, he guaranteed to cut them away sufficiently to admit of my breastbone coming out into the open once more. End of section 21. Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 10. Modes of the Moment, a Fashion Article, Part 3. In a week, he called me on the telephone and broke the sad news to me. My English riding pants would never ride me again. In using the shears he had made a fatal slip, and had irreparably damaged them in an essential location. However, he said I need not worry, because it might have been worse. From what he had already cut out of them he garnered enough material to make me a neat outing coat, and by scrimping he thought he might get a waistcoat to match. I have my English raincoat. It is still in a virgin state so far as wearing it is concerned. I may yet wear it, and I may not. If I wear it, and you meet me on the street, and we are strangers, you should experience no great difficulty in recognizing me. Just start in at almost any spot on the outer orbit, and walk round and round as though you were circling a sideshow tent looking for a chance to crawl under the canvas and see the curiosities for nothing, and after a while, if you keep on walking as directed, you will come to a person with a plain but substantial face, and that will be me in my new English raincoat. Then again, I may wear it to a fancy dress ball some time. In that case I shall stencil Pike's Peak or Bust on the side breadth and go as a prairie schooner. If I can succeed in training a Missouri hound dog to trail along immediately behind me, the illusion will be perfect. After these 2 experiences with the English tailor I gave up. Instead of trying to wear the apparel of the foreigner, I set myself to the study of it. I would avoid falling into the habit of making comparisons between European institutions and American institutions that are forever favorable to the American side of the argument. To my way of thinking, there is only one class of tourists. Americans to be encountered abroad are worse than the class who go into hysterical rapture over everything they see merely because it is European, and that is the class who condemn offhand everything they see and find fault with everything merely because it is not American. But I must say that in the matter of outer habiliment the American man wins the decision on points nearly every whack. In his evening garb, which generally fits him, but which generally is not pressed as to trouser legs and coat sleeves, the Englishman makes an exceedingly good appearance. The swallow-tailed coat was created for the Englishman, and he for it, but on all other occasions the well-dressed American leads him, leads the world for that matter. When a Frenchman attires himself in his fanciest regalia, he merely succeeds in looking effeminate, whereas a German, under similar circumstances, bears a wadded-in, bulged-out, stuffed-up appearance. I never saw a German in Germany whose hat was not too small for him, just as I never saw a Japanese in Occidental garb whose hat was not too large for him, if it was a derby hat. If a German has on a pair of trousers that flare out at the bottom and a coat with angel sleeves, I think that is the correct technical term, and if the front of his coat is spangled over with the largest size horn buttons obtainable, he regards himself as being dressed to the minute. As for the women, I believe even the supercritical mantua makers of Paris have begun to concede that, as a nation, the American women are the best dressed women on earth. The French women have a way of arranging their hair and of wearing their hats, and of draping their furs about their throats that is artistic beyond comparison. There may be a word in some folks' dictionaries fitly to describe it. There is no such word in mine, but when you have said that much you have said all there is to say. A French woman's feet are not shod well. French shoes, like all European shoes, are clumsy and awkward looking. English children are well dressed because they are simply dressed, and the children themselves, in contrast to the overdressed, overly aggressive youngsters so frequently encountered in America, are mannerly and self-effacing, and have sane, simple, childish tastes. Young English girls are fresh and natural, but frequently frumpy, and the English married woman is generally dressed in poor taste, and appears to have a most limited wardrobe. Apparently the husband buys all he wants, and then, if there is any money left over, the wife gets to spend it on herself. Venturing one morning into a London chapel, I saw a dowdy little woman of this type kneeling in a pew, chanting the responses to the service. Her blouse gaped open all the way down her back, and she was saying with much fervor, "We have left undone those things which we ought to have done." She had, too, but she didn't know it, as she knelt there unconsciously supplying a personal illustration for the spoken line. The typical high-born Englishwoman has pale blue eyes, a fine complexion, and a clear-cut, rather expressionless face, with a profile suggestive of the portraits seen on English postage stamps of the early Victorian period. But in the arranging of her hair any French shop-girl could give her lessons, and any smart American woman could teach her a lot about the knack of wearing clothes with distinction. In England, that land of caste which is rigid enough to be cast iron, all men, with the exception of petty tradespeople, dress to match the vocations they follow. In America no man stays put. He either goes forward to a circle above the one into which he was born, or he slips back into a lower one, and so he dresses to suit himself or his wife or his tailor. But in England the professional man advertises his calling by his clothes. Extreme stage types are ordinary types in London. No southern silver-tongued orator of the old-time, string-tied, slouch-hatted, long-haired variety ever clung more closely to his official make-up than the English barrister clings to his spats, his shad-bellied coat, and his eyeglass dangling on a cord. At a glance one knows the medical man or the journalist, the military man in undress or the gentleman farmer. Also, by the same easy method, one may know the working man and the penny postman. The working man has a cap on his head and a neckerchief about his throat, and the legs of his corduroy trousers are tied up below the knees with string, else he is no working man. When we were in London the postmen were threatening to go on strike. From the papers I gathered that the points in dispute had to do with better hours and better pay, but if they had been striking against having to wear the kind of cap the British government makes a postman wear, their cause would have had the cordial support and intense sympathy of every American in town. It remains for the English clerk to be the only Englishman who seeks, by the clothes he wears in his hours of ease, to appear as something more than what he really is. Off duty he fairly dotes on the high hat of commerce. Frequently he sports it in connection with an exceedingly short and bobby sack coat, and trousers that are 4 or 5 inches too short in the legs for him. The Parisian shopman harbors similar ambitions, only he expresses them with more attention to detail. The noon hour arriving, the French shop hand doffs his apron and his air of deference. He puts on a high hat and a frock coat that have been on a peg behind the door all the morning, gathers up his cane and his gloves, and becoming on the instant a swagger and a swaggering boulevardier, he saunters to his favorite sidewalk cafe for a cordial glassful of pink or green or purple drink. When his little hour of glory is over and done with, he returns to his counter, sheds his grandeur, and is once more your humble and ingratiating servitor. In residential London, on a Sunday afternoon, one beholds some weird and wonderful costumes. On a Sunday afternoon, in a sub-suburb of a Kensington suburb, I saw, passing through a drab, sad side street, a little Cockney man with the sketchy nose and unfinished features of his breed. He was, presumably, going to church, for he carried a large Testament under his arm. He wore, among other things, a pair of white spats, a long-tailed coat, and a high hat. It was not a regular high hat either, but one of those trick-performing hats which, on signal, will lie doggo or else sit up and beg, and he was riding a bicycle of an ancient vintage. The most impressively got-up civilians in England, or in the world either for that matter, are the assistant managers and the deputy cashiers of the big London hotels. Compared with them the lilies of the field are as lilies in the bulb. Their collars are higher, their ties are more resplendent, their frock coats more floppy as to the tail and more flappy as to the lapel than it is possible to imagine until you have seen it all with your own wondering eyes. They are haughty creatures too, austere and full of a starchy dignity, but when you come to pay your bill you find at least one of them lined up with the valet and the waiter, the manservant and the maidservant, the ox and the ass, hand out and palm open to get his tip. Having tipped him, you depart feeling ennobled and uplifted, as though you had conferred a purse of gold on a marquis. End of section 22. Section 23 of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 11. Dress to Kill, Part 1. With us it is the dress of the women that gives life and color to the shifting show of street life. In Europe it is the soldier, and in England the private soldier particularly. The German private soldier is too stiff, and the French private soldier is too limber, and the Italian private soldier has been away from the dry cleansers too long. But the British Tommy Atkins is a perfect piece of work, what with his dinky cap tilted over one eye, and his red tunic that fits him without blemish or wrinkle, and his snappy little swagger stick flirting the air. As a picture of a first-class fighting man, I know of but one to match him, and that is a khaki-clad, service-hatted Yankee regular. Long may he wave! There may be something finer in the way of a military spectacle than the change of Horse Guards at Whitehall or the march of the Foot Guards across the green in St. James's Park on a fine bright morning, but I do not know what it is. One day, passing Buckingham Palace, I came on a foot guard on duty in one of the little sentry boxes just outside the walls. He did not look as though he were alive. He looked as though he had been stuffed and mounted by a most expert taxidermist. From under his bear-skinned shako and from over his brazen chin-strap his face stared out unwinking and solemn and barren of thought. I said to myself, "It is taking a long chance, but I shall ascertain whether this party has any human emotions." So I halted directly in front of him and began staring fixedly at his midriff as though I saw a button unfastened there or a buckle disarranged. For a space of minutes I kept my gaze on him without cessation. Finally the situation grew painful, but it was not that British grenadier who grew embarrassed and fidgety. It was the other party to the transaction. His gaze never shifted, his eyes never wavered, but I came away feeling all wriggly. In no outward regard whatsoever did the soldiers on the Continent compare with the soldiers of the British archipelago. When he is not on actual duty the German private is always going somewhere in a great hurry, with something belonging to his superior officer, usually a riding horse or a specially heavy valise. On duty and off he wears that woodenness of expression, or rather, that wooden lack of expression, which is found nowhere in such flower of perfection as on the faces of German soldiers and German toys. The Germans prove they have a sense of humor by requiring their soldiers to march on parade with the goose step, and the French prove they have none at all by encasing the defenseless legs of their soldiers in those foolish red flannel pants that are manufactured in such profusion up at the Pantheon. In the event of another war between the two nations, I anticipate a frightful mortality among pants, especially if the French forces should be retreating. The German soldier is not a particularly good marksman as marksmen go, but he would have to be the worst shot in the world to miss a pair of French pants that were going away from him at the time. Still, when all is said and done, there is something essentially Frenchy about those red pants. There is something in their length that instinctively suggests a Toulon, and something in their breadth that makes you think of Toulouse. I realize that this joke, as it stands, is weak and imperfect. If there were only another French seaport called Toubag, I could round it out and improve it structurally. If the English private soldier is the trimmest, the Austrian officer is the most beautiful to look on. An Austrian officer is gaudier than the door-opener of a London café, or the porter of a Paris hotel. He achieves effects and gaudiness which even the Italian officer cannot equal. The Italian officer is addicted to cock feathers and horsetails on his helmet, to bits of yellow and blue let into his clothes, to tufts of red and green hung on him in unexpected and unaccountable spots. Either the design of bottled Italian Chianti is modelled after the Italian officer, or the Italian officer is modelled after the bottle of Chianti, which, though I am not prepared to say without further study of the subject. But the Austrian officer is the walking sunset effect of creation. For color schemes I know of nothing in nature equal to him except the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. Circus parades are unknown in Austria. They are not missed either. After an Austrian officer a street parade would seem a colorless and commonplace thing. In his uniform he runs to striking contrasts, canary yellow with light blue facings, silvers and grays, bright greens with scarlet slashings, and so on. His collar is the very highest of all high collars, and the heaviest with embroidery. His cloak is the longest and the widest, his boots the most varnished, his sword belt the broadest and the shiniest, and the medals on his bosom are the most numerous and the most glittering. Alf Ringling and John Philip Sousa would take one look at him, and then, mutually filled with an envious despair, They would go apart and hold a grand lodge of sorrow together. Also, he constantly wears his spurs and his sword. He wears them even when he is in a cafe in the evening listening to the orchestra, drinking beer, and allowing an admiring civilian to pay the check, and that, apparently, is every evening. There was one Austrian colonel who came one night into a cafe in Vienna, where we were, and sat down at the table next to us, and he put our eyes right out and made all the lights dim and flickery. His epaulets were 2 hairbrushes of augmented size, gold mounted, his plimsoll marks were outlined in bullion, and along his garboard strake ran lines of gold braid. But strangest of all to observe was the locality where he wore what appeared to be his service stripes. Instead of being on his sleeves, they were at the extreme southern exposure of his coat tails. I presume an Austrian officer acquires merit by sitting down. This particular officer's sabre kept jingling, and so did his spurs, and so did his bracelet. I almost forgot the bracelet. It was an ornate affair of gold links, fastened on his left wrist with a big gold locket, and it kept slipping down over his hand and rattling against his cuff. The chain bracelet locked on the left wrist is very common among Austrian officers. It adds just the final needed touch. I did not see any of them carrying lorgnettes or shower bouquets, but I think in summer they wear veils. One opportunity is afforded the European who is neither a soldier nor a hotel cashier to dress himself up in comic opera clothes, and that is when he a-hunting goes. An American going hunting puts on his oldest and most serviceable clothes; a European his giddiest, gayest, gladdest regalia. We were so favored by gracious circumstances as to behold several English gentlemen suitably attired for the chase, and we noted that the conventional morning costume of an English gentleman expecting to call informally on a pheasant or something during the course of the forenoon consisted, in the main, of a perfect deer of a Norfolk jacket, all over plates and pockets, with large leather buttons like oak galls adhering thickly to it, with a belt high up under the arms and a saucy tail sticking out behind, knee breeches, a high stock collar, shin-high leggings of buff or white, and a special hat, a truly adorable confection by the world's leading he-milliner. If you dared to wear such an outfit afield in America, the very dicky birds would fall into fits as you passed. The chipmunks would lean out of trees and just naturally laugh you to death. But in a land where the woodlands are well-kept groves, and the undergrowth, instead of being weedy and briery, is sweet-scented fern and gorse and bracken, I suppose it is all eminently correct. Thus apparelled, the Englishman goes to Scotland to shoot the grouse, the gilly, the heathercock, the niblick, the haggis, and other Scotch game. Thus apparelled, he ranges the preserve of his own fair shires in ardent pursuit of the English rabbit, which pretty nearly corresponds to the guinea pig, but is not so ferocious, and the English hare, which is first cousin to our Molly Cottontail, and the English pheasant, but particularly the pheasant. There was great excitement while we were in England concerning the pheasants. Either the pheasants were preying on the mangel-wurzels, or the mangel-wurzels were preying on the pheasants. At any rate, it had something to do with the Land Bill. Practically everything that happens in England has something to do with the Land Bill, and Lloyd George was in a free state of perspiration over it, and the papers were full of it, and altogether there was a great pother over it. We saw pheasants by the score. We saw them first from the windows of our railroad carriage, big beautiful birds nearly as large as barnyard fowls and as tame, feeding in the bare cabbage patches, regardless of the train chugging by not 30 yards away; and later we saw them again at still closer range as we strolled along the hay and holly-lined roads of the wonderful southern counties. They would scuttle on ahead of us, weaving in and out of the hedgerows, and finally, when we insisted on it and flung pebbles at them to emphasize our desires, they would get up, with a great drumming of wings and a fine comet-like display of flowing tail feathers on the part of the cockbirds, and go booming away to what passes in Sussex and Kent for dense cover, meaning by that thickets such as you might find in the upper end of Central Park. They say King George is one of the best pheasant shots in England. He also collects postage stamps when not engaged in his regular regal duties, such as laying cornerstones for new workhouses, and receiving presentation addresses from charity children. I have never shot pheasants, but having seen them in their free state as above described, and having in my youth collected postage stamps intermittently, I should say, speaking offhand, that of the two pursuits postage stamp collecting is infinitely the more exciting and dangerous. Through the closed season the keepers mind the pheasants, protecting them from poachers and feeding them on selected grain, but a day comes in October when the hunters go forth and take their stands at spaced intervals along a cleared aisle flanking the woods. Then the beaters dive into the woods from the opposite side, and when the tame and trusting creatures come clustering about their feet expecting provender, the beaters scare them up by waving their umbrellas at them, I think, and the pheasants go rocketing into the air. Rocketing is the correct sporting term. Go rocketing into the air like a flock of Sunday supplements, and the gallant gunner downs them in great multitudes, always taking care to avoid mussing his clothes. For after all the main question is, not what did he kill, but how does he look? At that I hold no brief for the pheasant. Except when served with bread-crumb dressing and currant jelly, he is no friend of mine. It ill becomes Americans, with our own record behind us, to chide other people for the senseless murder of wild things, and besides, speaking personally, I have a reasonably open mind on the subject of wild game shooting. Myself, I shot a wild duck once. He was not flying at the time. He was, as the stock word goes, setting. I had no self-reproaches afterward, however. As between that duck and myself, I regarded it as an even break, as fair for one as for the other, because at the moment I was, as we say, setting too. But if, in the interests of true sportsmanship, they must have those annual massacres, I certainly should admire to see what execution a pickled half-dozen of American quail hunters used to snap shooting in the cane jungles and briar patches of Georgia and Arkansas could accomplish among English pheasants, until such time as their conscience mastered them and they desisted from slaughter. End of section 23. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 11. Dress to Kill, Part 2. Be that as it may, pheasant shooting is the last word in the English sporting calendar. It is a sport strictly for the gentry. Except in the capacity of innocent bystanders, the lower orders do not share in it. It is much too good for them. Besides, they could not maintain the correct wardrobe for it. The classes derived one substantial benefit from the institution, however. The sporting instinct of the landed Englishman has led to the enactment of laws, under which an ordinary person goes smack to jail if he is caught sequestering a clandestine pheasant bird, but it does not militate against the landowner's peddling off his game after he has destroyed it. British thrift comes in here. And so, in carload lots, it is sold to the marketmen. The result is that, in the fall of the year, pheasants are cheaper than chickens, and any person who can afford poultry on his dinner table can afford pheasants. The continental hunter makes an even more spectacular appearance than his British brother. No self-respecting German or French sportsman would think of faring forth after the incarnate brown hare, or the ferocious wood-pigeon, unless he had on a green hat with a feather in it, and a green suit to match the hat, and swung about his neck with a cord a natty fur muff to keep his hands in between shots, and a swivel chair to sit in while waiting for the wild boar to come along and be bowled over. Being hunted with a swivel chair is what makes the German wild boar wild. On occasion, also, the hunter wears, suspended from his belt, a cute little hanger like a sawed-off saber, with which to cut the throats of his spoil. Then, when it has spoiled some more, they will serve it at a French restaurant. It was our fortune to be in France on the famous and ever memorable occasion when the official stag of the French Republic met a tragic and untimely end, under circumstances acutely distressing to all who believe in the dignity-bestowed prerogatives of the nobility. The Paris edition of the Herald printed the lamentable tale on its front page, and I clipped the account. I offer it here in exact reproduction, including the headline. Hunting incident said to be due to conspiracy. Further details are given in this morning's Figaro of the incident between Prince Murat and Monsieur Dachy, the mayor of Saint Felix, near Clermont, which was briefly reported in yesterday's Herald. A regular conspiracy was organized by Monsieur Dachy, it is alleged, in order to secure the stag Prince Murat and Comte de Vallon were hunting in the forest of La Nouvelle-Enhance. Already at the outset of the hunt, Monsieur Dachy, according to Le Figaro, charged at a huntsman with a little automobile in which he was driving and threatened to fire. Then, when the stag ran into the wood, near the Terai river, one of his keepers shot it. In great haste the animal was loaded on another automobile, and before either the Prince or the Comte de Vallon could interfere it was driven away. While Comte de Vallon spurred his horse in pursuit, Prince Murat disarmed the man who had shot the stag, for he was levelling his gun at another huntsman. But before the gun was wrenched from his hands he had struck Prince Desling, Prince Murat's uncle, across the face with the butt. Meantime, Comte de Vallon had overtaken the automobile and, though threatened with revolvers by its occupants, would have recaptured the stag if the men in charge of it had not taken it into the house of Monsieur Dachy's father. The only course left for Prince Murat and Comte de Vallon was to lodge a complaint with the police for assault and for killing the stag, which Monsieur Dachy refused to give back. From this you may see how very much more exciting stag hunting is in France than in America. Comparing the two systems we find but one point of resemblance, namely, the attempted shooting of a huntsman. In the North Woods we do a good deal of that sort of thing. However, with us it is not yet customary to charge the prospective victim in a little automobile. That may come in time. Our best bags are made by the stalking or still hunting method. Our city-raised sportsman slips up on his guide and pots him from arrest. But consider the rest of the description so graphically set forth by Le Figaro. The intriguing of the mayor, the opposing groups rampaging around, some on horseback and some in automobile runabouts, the intense disappointment of the high-born Prince Murat and his uncle, the Prince Desling, and his friend, the Comte de Vallon, the implied grief of the stag at being stricken down by other than noble hands, the action of the base-born commoner who shot the stag in striking the Prince Desling across his pained and aristocratic face with the butt, exact type of butt and name of owner not being given. Only in its failure to clear up this important point, and in omitting to give descriptions of the costumes worn by the two princes and the Comte, is Le Figaro's story lacking. They must have been wearing the very latest creations, too. This last brings me back again to the subject of clothes, and serves to remind me that, contrary to a belief prevalent on this side of the water, good clothes cost as much abroad as they cost here. In England a man may buy gloves and certain substantial articles of haberdashery and silk and linen and wool at a much lower figure than in America. And in Italy he will find crocheted handbags and bead necklaces are to be had cheaper than at home, provided, of course, he cares for such things as crocheted handbags and bead necklaces. Handmade laces and embroideries and sundry other feminine fripperies, so women tell me, are moderately priced on the Continent, if so be the tourist purchaser steers clear of the more fashionable shops and chases the elusive bargain down in a back street. But, quality considered, other things cost as much in Europe as they cost here, and frequently they cost more. If you buy at the shopkeeper's first price he has a secret contempt for you. If you haggle him down to a reasonably fair valuation, say about twice the amount a native would pay for the same thing, he has a half-concealed contempt for you. If you refuse to trade at all he has an open contempt for you, and in any event he dislikes you because you are an American. So there you are. No matter how the transaction turns out you have his contempt. It is the only thing he parts with at cost. It is true that you may buy a suit of clothes for $10 in London. So also you may buy a suit of clothes for $10 in any American city. But the reasonably affluent American doesn't buy $10 suits at home. He saves himself up to indulge in that form of idiocy abroad. In Paris or Rome you may get a 5-course dinner with wine for 40 cents. So you may get in certain quarters of New York, but in either place the man who can afford to pay more for his dinner will find it to his ultimate well-being to do so. Simply because a boarding house in France or Italy is known as a pension doesn't keep it from being a boarding house, and a pretty average bad one, as I have been informed by misguided Americans who tried living at a pension, and afterwards put in a good deal of their spare time regretting it. Altogether, looking back on my own experiences, I can at this time of writing think of but two common commodities which, when grade is taken into the equation, are found to be radically cheaper in Europe than in America. These two things being taxicabs and counts. For their cleanliness and smartness of aspect, and their reasonableness of meter fare, taxicabs all over Europe are a constant joy to the travelling American. And though in the United States counts are so costly that only the marriageable daughters of the very wealthy may afford to buy them, and even then, as the count calendars attest, have the utmost difficulty in keeping them after they are bought, in continental Europe anywhere one may for a moderate price hire a true-born count to do almost any small job, from guiding one through an art gallery to waiting on one at table. Counts make indifferent guides, but are middling fair waiters. Outside of the counts and the taxicabs and the food in Germany, I found in all Europe just one real overpowering bargain, and that was in Naples, where, as a general thing, bargains are not what they seem. For the exceedingly moderate outlay of 1 lira, Italian, or 20 cents American, I secured this combination, to wit, as follows. In the background old Vesuvius, like a wicked fallen angel, wearing his plumy, fumy halo of sulphurous hell-smoke; in the middle distance the Bay of Naples, each larcenous wave crest in it triple-plated with silvern glory pilfered from a splendid moon; on the left the riding lights of a visiting squadron of American warships; on the right the myriad slanted sails of the coral fishers' boats, beating out toward Capri, with the curlew calls of the fishermen floating back in shrill snatches to meet a jangle of bell and bugle from the fleet; in the immediate foreground a competent and accomplished family troupe of 6 Neapolitan troubadours, men, women, and children, some of them playing guitars, and all 6 of them, with fine mellow voices and tremendous dramatic effect, singing, the words being Italian but the air good American, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave." I defy you to get more than that for 20 cents anywhere in the world. End of section 24. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 12. Nightlife, with the life part missing, Part 1. In our consideration of this topic, we first come to the night life of the English. They have none. Passing along to the next subject under the same heading, which is the night life of Paris, we find here so much night life, of such a delightfully transparent and counterfeit character, so much made-to-measure devilry, so many members of the Madcaps' Union engaged on piece-work, so much delicious, hoydenish derring-do, all carefully stage-managed and expertly timed for the benefit of North and South American spenders, to the end that the deliriousness shall abate automatically in exact proportion as the spenders quit spending. In short, so much of what is typically Parisian that, really Paris, on its merits, is entitled to a couple of chapters of its own. All of which naturally brings us to the 2 remaining great cities of mid-Europe, Berlin and Vienna, and leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the Europeans, in common with all other peoples on the earth, only succeed, when they try to be desperately wicked, in being desperately dull; whereas when they seek their pleasures in a natural manner they present racial slants and angles that are very interesting to observe, and very pleasant to have a hand in. Take the Germans now. No less astute a world traveller than Samuel G. Blythe is sponsor for the assertion that the Berliners follow the night life route because the Kaiser found his capital did not attract the tourist types to the extent he had hoped, and so decreed that his faithful and devoted subjects, leaving their cozy hearths and inglenooks, should go forth at the hour when graveyards yawn, and who could blame them, to spend the dragging time until dawn in being merry and bright. So saying, his Majesty went to bed, leaving them to work while he slept. After viewing the situation at first hand, the present writer is of the opinion that Mr. Blythe was quite right in his statements. Certainly nothing is more soothing to the eye of the onlooker, nothing more restful to his soul, than to behold a group of Germans enjoying themselves in a normal manner. And absolutely nothing is quite so ghastly sad as the sight of those same well-fleshed Germans cavorting about between the hours of 2 and 4:30 a.m., trying, with all the pachydermic preponderancy of Barnum's elephant quadrille, to be professionally gay and cut-uppish. The Prussians must love their Kaiser dearly. We sit up with our friends when they are dead; they stay up for him until they are ready to die themselves. As is well known, Berlin abounds in pleasure palaces, so called. Enormous palaces these are, where under one wide-spreading roof are 3 or 4 separate restaurants of augmented size, not to mention wine cellars and beer caves below stairs, and a dance hall or so, and a Turkish bath, and a bar, and a skating rink, and a concert hall, and any number of private dining rooms. The German mind invariably associates size with enjoyment. To these establishments, after his regular dinner, the Berliner repairs with his family, his friend, or his guest. There is one especially popular resort, a combination of restaurant and vaudeville theatre, at which one eats an excellent dinner excellently served, and between courses witnesses the turns of a first-rate variety bill, always with the inevitable team of American coon shouters, either in fast colours of the burnt cork variety, sandwiched into the programme somewhere. In the Friedrichstrasse there is another place, called the Admiralspalast, which is even more attractive. Here, enclosing a big oval-shaped ice arena, balcony after balcony rises circling to the roof. On one of these balconies you sit, and while you dine and after you have dined, you look down on a most marvellous series of skating stunts. In rapid and bewildering succession there are ballets on skates, solo skating numbers, skating carnivals, and skating races. Finally, scenery is slid on in runners, and the whole company, in costumes grotesque and beautiful, go through a burlesque that keeps you laughing when you are not applauding, and admiring when you are doing neither, while alternating light waves from overhead electric devices flood the picture with shifting, shimmering tides of color. It is like seeing a Christmas pantomime under an aurora borealis. In America we could not do these things, at least we have never done them. Either the performance would be poor, or the provender would be highly expensive, or both. But here the show is wonderful, and the victuals are good and not extravagantly priced, and everybody has a bully time. At 11:30 or thereabout, the show at the Ice Palace is over, concluding with a push-ball match between teams of husky maidens who were apparently born on skates and raised on skates, and would not feel natural unless they were curvetting about on skates. Their skates seem as much a part of them as tails to mermaids. It is bedtime now for sane folks, but at this moment a certain madness which does not at all fit in with the true German temperament descends on the crowd. Some go upstairs to another part of the building, where there is a dance hall called the Admiralskasino, but to the truly swagger one should hasten to the Palais du Danse on the second floor of the big Metropolpalast in the Behrenstrasse. This place opens promptly at midnight and closes promptly at 2 o'clock in the morning. Inasmuch as the Palais du Danse is an institution borrowed outright from the French, they have adopted a typically French custom here. As the visitor enters, if he be a stranger, a flunkey in gorgeous livery intercepts him, and demands an entrance fee amounting to about $1.25 in our money, as I recall. This tariff the American or Englishman pays, but the practised Berliner merely suggests to the doorkeeper the expediency of his taking a long running start and jumping off into space, and stalks defiantly in without forking over a single pfennig to any person whatsoever. The Palais du Danse is incomparably the most beautiful ballroom in the world, so people who have been all over the world agree, and it is spotlessly clean and free from brackish smells, which is more than can be said of any French establishment of similar character I have seen. At the Palais du Danse the patron sits at a table, a table with something on it besides a cloth being an essential adjunct to complete the enjoyment of an evening of a German revelry. And as he sits and drinks he listens to the playing of a splendid band and looks on the dancing. Nothing is drunk except wine, and by wine I mainly mean champagne of the most sweetish and sickish brand obtainable. Elsewhere, for 1/20th the cost, the German could have the best and purest beer that is made, but he is out now for the big night. Accordingly he saturates his tissues with the sugary bubble water of France. He does not join in the dancing himself. The men dancers are nearly all paid dancers, I think, and the beautifully clad women who dance are either professionals too, or else belong to a profession that is older even than dancing is. They all dance with a profound German gravity and precision. Here is music to set a wooden leg a-jigging, but these couples circle and glide and dip with an incomprehensible decorum and slowness. When we were there, they were dancing the tango or one of its manifold variations. All Europe, like all America, was, for the moment, tango mad. While we were in Paris, M. Jean Richepin lectured before the French immortals of the 5 academies assembled, in solemn conclave at the Institute of France. They are called the 40 immortals because nobody can remember the names of more than 5 of them. He took for his subject the tango, his motto, in short, being one borrowed from the conductors in the New York subway: "Mind your step." While he spoke, which was for an hour or more, the bebadged and beribboned bosoms of his illustrious compatriots heaved with emotion. Their faces, or such parts of their faces as were visible above the whisker line, flushed with enthusiasm, and most vociferously they applauded his masterly phrasing and his tracing out of the evolution of the tango, all the way from its genesis, as it were, to its revelation. I judge the revelation particularly appealed to them, that part of it appeals to so many. After that the tango seemed literally to trail us. We could not escape it. While we were in Berlin the Emperor saw fit officially to forbid the dancing of the tango by officers of his navy and army. We reached England just after the vogue for tango teas had started. Naturally we went to one of these affairs. It took place at a theatre. Such is the English way of interpreting the poetry of motion, to hire someone else to do it for you, and, in order to get the worth of your money, to sit and swizzle tea while the paid performer is doing it. At the tango tea we patronized, the tea was up to standard, but the dancing of the box-ankled professionals was a disappointment. Beforehand I had been told that the scene on the stage would be a veritable picture. And so it was. Rosa Bonheur's Horse Fair. End of section 25. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 12. Nightlife, with the life part missing, Part 2. As a matter of fact, the best dancer I saw in Europe was a performing trick pony in a winter circus in Berlin. I also remember with distinctness of detail a chorus man who took part in a new Lehar opera there in Berlin. I do not remember him for his dancing, because he was no clumsier of foot than his compatriots in the chorus rank and file, or for his singing, since I could not pick his voice out from the combined voices of the others. I remember him because he wore spectacles. Not a monocle, nor yet a pair of nose-glasses, but heavy-rimmed, double-lensed German spectacles with gold bows extending up behind his ears like the roots of an old-fashioned wisdom tooth. Come to think about it, I know of no reason why a chorusman should not wear spectacles if he needs them in his business, or if he thinks they will add to his native beauty, but the spectacle of that bolster-built youth, dressed now as a Spanish cavalier and now as a Venetian gondolier, prancing about with his spectacles goggling owlishly out at the audience, and once in a while, when a gleam from the footlights caught on them, turning to 2 red-hot discs set in the middle of his face, was a thing that is going to linger in my memory when a lot of more important matters are entirely forgotten. Not even in Paris did the tango experts compare with the tango experts one sees in America. At this juncture I pause a moment, giving opportunity for some carping critic to rise and call my attention to the fact that perhaps the most distinguished of the early school of turkey trotters bears a French name and came to us from Paris. To which I reply that so he does and so he did, but I add then the counter-argument that he came to us by way of Paris, at the conclusion of a round trip that started in the old Fourth Ward of the borough of Manhattan, city of Greater New York, for he was born and bred on the East Side, and moreover was born bearing the name of a race of kings famous in the south of Ireland and along the Bowery. And he learned his art, not only the rudiments of it, but the final finished polish of it, in the dance halls of Third Avenue, where the best slow-time dancers on earth come from. It was after he had acquired a French accent and had Gallicized his name, thereby causing a general turning over of old settlers in the graveyards of the County Clare, that he returned to us, a conspicuous figure in the world of art and fashion, and was able to get $25 an hour for teaching the sons and daughters of our richest families to trip the light fantastic go. At the same time, be it understood, I am not here to muckrake the past of one so prominent and affluent in the most honored and lucrative of modern professions. But facts are facts, and these particular facts are quoted here to bind and buttress my claim that the best dancers are the American dancers. After this digression, let us hurry right back to that loyal Berliner whom we left seated in the Palais du Danse on the Behrenstrasse, waiting for the hour of 2 in the morning to come. The hour of 2 in the morning does come, the lights die down, the dancers pick up their heavy feet (it takes an effort to pick up those continental feet) and quit the waxen floor. The Oberkellner comes round with his gold chain of office dangling on his breast and collects for the wine, and our German friend, politely inhaling his yawns, gets up and goes elsewhere to finish his good time. And gall darn it, how he does dread it! Yet he goes, faithful soul that he is. He goes, let us say, to the Pavilion Mascotte. No dancing, but plenty of drinking and music and food, which opens at 2 and stays open until 4, when it shuts up shop in order that another place in the nature of a cabaret may open. And so, between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning of the new day, when the lady garbage-men and the gentlemen chambermaids of the German capital are abroad on their several duties, he journeys homeward, and so, as Mr. Pepys said, to bed, with nothing disagreeable to look forward to except repeating the same dose all over again the coming night. This sort of thing would kill anybody except a Prussian. For mark you, between intervals of drinking he has been eating all night, but then a Prussian has no digestion. He merely has gross tonnage in the place where his digestive apparatus ought to be. The time to see a German enjoying himself is when he is following his own bent, and not obeying the imperial edict of his gracious sovereign. I had a most excellent opportunity of observing him while engaged in his own private pursuits of pleasure, when, by chance one evening, in the course of a solitary prowl, I bumped into a sort of Berlinesque version of Coney Island, with the island part missing. It was not out in the suburbs where one would naturally expect to find such a resort. It was in the very middle of the city, just round the corner from the cafe district, not more than half a mile, as the Blutwurst flies, from Unter den Linden. Even at this distance, and after a considerable lapse of time, I can still appreciate that place, though I cannot pronounce it, for it had a name consisting of one of those long German compound words that run all the way round a fellow's face and lap over at the back, like a clergyman's collar, and it had also a sub-name that no living person could hope to utter unless he had a thorough German education and throat trouble. You meet such nouns frequently in Germany. They are not meant to be spoken, you gargle them. To speak the full name of this park would require 2 able-bodied persons, one to start it off and carry it along until his larynx gave out, and the other to take it up at that point and finish it. But for all the 9-jointed impressiveness of its title, this park was a live, brisk little park full of sideshow tents sheltering mildly amusing, faked-up attractions, with painted banners flapping in the air, and barkers spieling before the entrances, and all the ballyhoos going at full blast. altogether a creditable imitation of a street fair as witnessed in any American town that has a good live Elks' Lodge in it. Plainly the place was popular. Germans of all conditions and all ages and sizes, but mainly the broader lasts, were winding about it in thick streams in the narrow, crooked alleys formed by the various tents. They packed themselves in front of each booth where a free exhibition was going on, and when the free part was over and the regular performance began, they struggled good-naturedly to pay the admission fee and enter in at the door. And for a price there were freaks to be seen who properly belonged on our side of the water, it seemed to me. I had always supposed them to be exclusively domestic articles until I encountered them here. There was a regular Bosco, a genuine hare he alive them eats, sitting in his canvas den entirely surrounded by a choice and tasty selection of eating snakes. The orthodox tattooed man was there too, first standing up to display the text and accompanying illustrations on his front cover, and then turning around so the crowd might read what he said on the other side. And there was many another familiar freak introduced to our fathers by old Dan Rice and to us, their children, through the good offices of Daniel's long and noble line of successors. A seasonable Sunday is a fine time, and the big zoological garden, which is a favorite place for studying the Berlin populace at the diversions they prefer when left to their own devices. At one table will be a cluster of students, with their queer little pillbox caps of all colors, their close-cropped heads and well-shaved necks, and their saber-scarred faces. At the next table half a dozen spectacled, long-coated men, who look as though they might be university professors, are confabbing earnestly. And at the next table, and the next, and the next, and so on, until the aggregate runs into big figures, are family groups, grandsires, fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, and children, on down to the babies in arms. By the unaccountable thousands they spend the afternoon here, munching sausages and sipping lager, and enjoying the excellent music that is invariably provided. At each plate there is a beer mug, for everybody is forever drinking and nobody is ever drunk. You see a lot of this sort of thing, not only in the parks and gardens so numerous in and near any German city, but anywhere on the continent. Seeing it helps an American to understand a main difference between the American Sabbath and the European Sunday. We keep it, and they spend it. I am given to understand that Vienna night life is the most alluring, the most abandoned, the most wicked and the wildest of all night life. Probably this is so. Certainly it is the most cloistered and the most inaccessible. The Viennese does not deliberately exploit his night life to prove to all the world that he is a gay dog and will not go home until morning though it kill him, as the German does. Neither does he maintain it for the sake of the coin to be extracted from the pockets of the tourists, as do the Parisians. With him, his night life is a thing he has created and which he supports for his own enjoyment. And so it goes on, not out in the open, not press-agented, not advertised, but behind closed doors. He does not care for the stranger's presence, nor does he suffer it either, unless the stranger is properly vouched for. The best theatres in Vienna are small, exclusive affairs, privately supported, and with seating capacity for a few chosen patrons. Once he has quit the public café with its fine music and its bad waiters, the uninitiated traveller has a pretty lonesome time of it in Vienna. Until all hours he may roam the principal streets seeking that fillip of wickedness which will give zest to life and provide him with something to brag about when he gets back among the home folks again. He does not find it. Charades would provide a much more exciting means of spending the evening, and in comparison with the sights he witnesses, anagrams and acrostics are positively thrilling. He is tantalized by the knowledge that all about him there are big doings, but so far as he is concerned he might just as well be attending a Sunday school cantata. Unless he be suitably introduced he will never have a chance to shake a foot with anybody, or buy a drink for somebody in the inner circles of Viennese night life. He is emphatically on the outside, denied even the poor satisfaction of looking in. At that I have a suspicion, born of casual observation among other races, that the Viennese has really a better time when he is not trying than when he is trying. End of section 26. 7 of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 13. Our Friend the Assassin, Part 1. No taste of the night life of Paris is regarded as complete without a visit to an Apache resort at the fag end of it. For orderly and law-abiding people, the disorderly and law-breaking people always have an immense fascination, anyhow. The average person, though inclined to blink at whatever prevalence of the criminal classes may exist in his own community, desires above all things to know at first hand about the criminals of other communities. In these matters charity begins at home. Every New Yorker who journeys to the West wants to see a few road agents. Conversely, the Westerner sojourning in New York pesters his New York friends to lead him to the haunts of the gangsters. It makes no difference that in a Western town the prize hold-up man is more apt than not to be a real estate dealer, that in New York the average run of citizens know no more of gangs than they know of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is to say, nothing at all. Human nature comes to the surface just the same. In Paris they order this thing differently. They exhibit the same spirit of enterprise that in a lesser degree characterized certain promoters of rubberneck tours who some years ago fitted up make-believe opium dens in New York's Chinatown for the odd delectation of out-of-town spectators. Knowing from experience that every other American who lands in Paris will crave to observe the Apache while the Apache is in the act of Apaching round, the canny Parisians have provided a line of up-to-date Apache dens within easy walking distance of Montmartre, and thither the guides lead the round-eyed tourist, and there introduce him to well-drilled, carefully made-up Apaches and Apachesses engaged in their customary sports and pastimes for as long as he is willing to pay out money for the privilege. Being forewarned of this, I naturally desired to see the genuine article. I took steps to achieve that end. Suitably chaperoned by a trio of transplanted Americans who knew a good bit about the Paris underworld, I rode over miles of bumpy cobblestones until, along about 4 o'clock in the morning, our taxicab turned into a dim back street opening off one of the big public markets, and drew up in front of a grimy establishment rejoicing in the happy and well-chosen name of the Cave of Innocence. Alighting, we passed through a small boozing ken, where a frowsy woman presided over a bar, serving drinks to smocked marketmen, and at the rear descended a steep flight of stone steps. At the foot of the stairs we came on 2 gendarmes who sat side by side on a wooden bench, having apparently nothing else to do except to caress their goatees and finger their swords. Whether the gendarmes were stationed here to keep the Apaches from preying on the marketmen, or the marketmen from preying on the Apaches, I know not. But having subsequently purchased some fresh fruit in that selfsame market, I should say now that if anybody about the premises needed police protection, it was the Apaches. My money would be on the marketmen every time. Beyond the couchant gendarmes we traversed a low, winding passage cut of stone, and so came at length to what seemingly had originally been a wine vault, hollowed out far down beneath the foundations of the building. The ceiling was so low that a tall man must stoop to avoid knocking his head off. The place was full of smells that had crawled in a couple of 100 years before and had died without benefit of clergy, and had remained there ever since. For its chief item of furniture the cavern had a wicked old piano, with its lid missing, so that its yellowed teeth showed in a perpetual snarl. I judged some of its most important vital organs were missing too, after I heard it played. On the walls were inscribed such words as naughty little schoolboys write on schoolhouse fences in this country, and more examples of this pleasing brand of literature were carved on the whittled oak benches and the rickety wooden stools. So much for the physical furbishings. By rights, by all the hallowed rules and precedents of the American vaudeville stage, the denizens of this cosy retreat in the bowels of the earth should have been wearing high-waisted, baggy velvet trousers, and drinking absinthe out of the large flagons, and stabbing one another between the shoulder blades, and ever and anon, in the mystic mazes of the dance, playing crack the whip with the necks and heels of their adoring lady friends. But such was not found to be the case. In all these essential and traditional regards, the assembled innocents were as poignantly disappointing as the costers of London had proved themselves. According to all the printed information on the subject, the London coster wears clothes covered up with pearl buttons, and spends his time swapping ready repartee with his Donna or his Dina. The costers I saw were barren of pearl buttons and silent of speech, and almost invariably they had left their Donnas at home. Similarly, these gentlemen habitués of the Cave of Innocence wore few or no velvet pants, and guzzled little or none of the absinthe. Their favourite tipple appeared to be beer, and their female companions snuggled closely beside them. We stayed among them fully 20 minutes, but not a single person was stabbed while we were there. It must have been an off night for stabbings. Still, I judged them to have been genuine exhibits because here, for the first, last, and only time in Paris, I found a shop where a stranger ready to spend a little money was not welcomed with vociferous enthusiasm. The paired-off cave-dwellers merely scowled on us as we scrounged past them to a vacant bench in a far corner. The waiter, though, bowed before us, a shock-headed personage in the ruins of a dress suit, at the same time saying words which I took to be complimentary, until one of my friends explained that he had called us something that might freely be translated as a certain kind of female lobster. Circumscribed by our own inflexible and unyielding language, we in America must content ourselves with calling a man a plain lobster, but the limber-tongued Gaul goes further than that. He calls you a female lobster, which seems somehow or other to make it more binding. However, I do not really think the waiter meant to be deliberately offensive, for presently, having first served us with beer which for obvious reasons we did not drink, he stationed himself alongside the infirm piano and rendered a little ballad to the effect that all men were spiders and all women were snakes, and that all the world was a green poison, so right off I knew what his trouble was, for I had seen many persons just as morbidly affected as himself down in the malaria belt of the United States, where everybody has liver for breakfast every morning. The waiter was bilious, that was what ailed him. For the sake of the conventions I tried to feel apprehensive of grave peril. It was no use. I felt safe, not exactly comfortable, but perfectly safe. I could not even muster up a spasm of the spine when a member of our party leaned over and whispered in my ear that any one of these gentry round about us would cheerfully cut a man's throat for 25 cents. I was surprised, though, at the moderation of the cost. This was the only cheap thing I had struck in Paris. It was cheaper even than the same job is supposed to be in the district round Chatham Square on the east side of New York, where the credulous stranger so frequently is told that he can have a plain murder done for $5, or a fancy murder, with trimmings, for $10, rate card covering other jobs on application. In America, however, it has been my misfortune that I did not have the right amount handy, and here in Paris I was handicapped by my inability to make change correctly. By now I would not have trusted any one in Paris to make change for me, not even an Apache. I was sorry for this, for at a quarter a head I should have been very glad to engage a troop of Apaches to kill me about $2 worth of cab drivers and waiters. For one of the waiters at our hotel I would have been willing to pay as much as 50 cents, provided they killed him very slowly. Because of the reasons named, however, I had to come away without making any deal, and I have always regretted it. At the outset of the chapter immediately preceding this one, I said the English had no night life. This was a slight but a pardonable misstatement of the actual facts. The Englishman has not so much night life as the Parisian, the Berliner, the Viennese, or the Budapest, but he has more night life in his town of London than the Roman has in his town of Rome. In Rome, night life for the foreigner consists of going indoors at eventide and until bedtime figuring up how much money he has been skinned out of during the course of the day just done, and for the native in going indoors and counting up how much money he has skinned the foreigner out of during the day aforesaid. London has its night life, but it ends early, in the very shank of the evening, so to speak. This is due in a measure to the operation of the early closing law, which, however, does not apply if you are a bona fide traveller stopping at your own inn. There the ancient tavern law protects you. You may sit at ease, and, if so minded, may drink and eat until daylight doth appear or doth not appear, as is generally the case in the foggy season. There is another law, of newer origin, to prohibit the taking of children under a certain age into a public house. On the passage of this act there at once sprang up a congenial and lucrative employment for those horrible old women drunkards who are so distressingly numerous in the poorer quarters of the town. Regardless of the weather, one of these bedrabbled creatures stations herself just outside the door of a pub. Along comes a mother with a thirst, and a child. Surrendering her offspring to the temporary care of the hag, the mother goes within and has her refreshment at the bar. When, wiping her mouth on the back of her hand, she comes forth to reclaim her youngster, she gives the other woman a halfpenny for her trouble, and eventually the other woman harvests enough halfpenny to buy a dram of gin for herself. On a rainy day I have seen a draggled, Sary-Gamp-looking female caring for as many as 4 damp infants under the drippy portico of an East End groggery. It is to the cafés that the early closing law chiefly applies. The cafés are due to close for business within half an hour after midnight. When the time for shutting up draws nigh, the managers do not put their lingering patrons out physically. The individual's body is a sacred thing, personal liberty being most dear to an Englishman. It will be made most dear to you, too, in the law courts, if you infringe on it by violence or otherwise. No, they have a gentler system than that, one that is free from noise, excitement, and all mussy work. Along toward 12 o'clock the waiters begin going about turning out the lights. The average London restaurant is none too brightly illuminated to start with, being a dim and dingy, ill-kept place compared with the glary, shiny Lobster Palace that we know, so instantly you are made aware of a thickening of the prevalent gloom. The waiters start in at the far end of the room and turn out a few lights. Drawing nearer and nearer to you they turn out more lights, and finally, by way of strengthening the hint, they turn out the lights immediately above your head, which leaves you in the stilly dark with no means of seeing your food even, unless you have taken the precaution to spread phosphorus on your sandwich instead of mustard, which, however, is seldom done. A better method is to order a portion of one of the more luminous varieties of imported cheese. End of section 27. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 13. Our Friend the Assassin, Part 2. The best thing of all, however, is to take your hat and stick and go away from there. And then, unless you belong to a regular club or carry a card of admission to one of the chartered all-night clubs that have sprung up so abundantly in London, which are uniformly stuffy, stupid places, where the members take their roistering seriously, or as a last resort, unless you care to sit for a tiresome hour or two in the grill of your hotel, you might as well be toddling away to bed. That is to say, you might as well go to bed unless you find the scenes in the street as worth while as I found them. At this hour London's droning voice has abated to a deep, hoarse snore. London has become a great, broody giant, taking rest that is troubled by snatches of wakefulness. London's grimy, lined face shows new wrinkles of shadow, and new and unexpected clumping of colours in monotone and half-tone appear. From the massed-up bulk of things small detached bits stand vividly out. A flower girl, whose flowers and whose girlhood are alike in the sere and yellow leaf. A soldier swaggering by, his red coat lighting up the greyish mass about him like a live coal in an ash-heap. A policeman escorting a drunk to quarters for the night, not, mind you, escorting him in a clanging, rushing patrol wagon which would serve to attract the public attention to the distressing state of the overcome one, but conveying him quietly, unostentatiously, surreptitiously almost, in a small wheeled vehicle partaking somewhat of the nature of a baby carriage and somewhat of the nature of a push-cart. The policeman shoves this along the road jailward, and the drunk lies at rest in it, stretched out full length, with a neat rubber bedspread drawn up over his prostrate form to screen him from draughts and save his face from the gaze of the vulgar. Drunkards are treated with the tenderest consideration in London, for, as you know, Britons never will be slaves, though some of them in the presence of a title give such imitations of being slaves as might fool even so experienced a judge as the late Simon Legree, and, as perchance you might have also heard, an Englishman's souse is his castle. So in due state they ride him and his turreted souse to the station house in a perambulator. From midnight to daylight the taxicabs by the countless swarm will be charging about in every direction, charging moreover at the rate of 8d. a mile. Think that over, ye taxi-taxed wretches of New York, and rend your garments with lamentations loud. There is also this to be said of the London taxi service, and to an American it is one of the abiding marvels of the place, that no matter where you go, no matter how late the hour or how outlying and obscure the district, there is always a trim taxicab just round the next corner waiting to come instantly at your whistle, and with it a beggar with a bleak, hopeless face to open the cab door for you and stand, hat in hand, for the penny you toss him. In the main centres, such as Oxford Circus and Piccadilly Circus and Charing Cross, and along the Embankment, the Strand, and the Pall Mall, they are as thick as fleas on the Missouri hound dog famous in song and story. The taxis, I mean, though the beggars are reasonably thick also, and they hop like fleas, bearing you swiftly and surely and cheaply on your way. The meters are honest, open-faced meters, and the drivers ask no more than their legal fares and are satisfied with tips within reason. Here in America we have the kindred arts of taxidermy and taxicabbery. One of these is the art of skinning animals, and the other is the art of skinning people. The ruthless taxi robber of New York would not last half an hour in London. For him the jail doors would yawn. Old-time Londoners deplored the coming of the taxicab and the motor bus, for their coming meant the entire extinction of the driver of the horse-drawn bus, who was an institution, and the practical extinction of the hansom cabby, who was a type and very frequently a humorous too. But an American finds no fault with the present arrangement. He is amply satisfied with it. Personally, I can think of no more exciting phase of the night life of the two greatest cities of Europe than the stunt of dodging taxicabs. In London, the peril that lurks for you at every turning is not the result of carelessness on the part of the drivers, it is due to the rules of the road. Afoot, an Englishman meeting you on the sidewalk turns, as we do, to the right hand, but mounted he turns to the left. The foot passenger's prerogative of turning to the right was one of the priceless heritages wrested from King John by the barons at Runnymede, but when William the Conqueror rode into the battle of Hastings he rode a left-handed horse, and so very naturally and very properly everything on hoof or wheel in England has consistently turned to the left ever since. I took some pains to look up the original precedents for these facts and to establish them historically. The system suits the English mind, but it is highly confusing to an American who gets into the swirl of traffic at a crossing, and every London crossing is a swirl of traffic most of the time, and looks left where he should look right, and looks right when he should be looking left, until the very best he can expect, if he survive at all, is cross eyes and nervous prostration. I lost count of the number of close calls from utter and mussy destruction I had while in London. Sometimes a policeman took pity on me and saved me, and again, by quick and frenzied leaping, I saved myself. But then the London cabmen were poor marksmen at best. In front of the Savoy one night, the same cabman in rapid succession had two beautiful shots at me, and each time missed the bull's-eye by a disqualifying margin of inches. A New York chauffeur, who had failed to splatter me all over the vicinage at the first chance, would have been ashamed to go home afterward and look his innocent little ones in the face. Even now I cannot decide in my own mind which is the more fearsome and perilous thing, to be afoot in Paris at the mercy of all the maniacs who drive French motor cars, or to be in one of the motor cars at the mercy of one of the maniacs. Motoring in Paris is the most dangerous sport known, just as duelling is the safest. There are some arguments to be advanced in favor of dueling. It provides copy for the papers and harmless excitement for the participants, and it certainly gives them a chance to get a little fresh air occasionally, but with motoring it is different. In Paris there are no rules of the road except just these two. The pedestrian who gets run over is liable to prosecution, and all motor cars must travel at top speed. If I live to be a million I shall never get over shuddering as I think back to a taxicab ride I had in the rush hour one afternoon over a route that extended from away down near the side of the Bastille to a hotel away up near the Place Vendôme. The driver was a congenital madman, the same as all Parisian taxicab drivers are, and in addition he was on this occasion acquiring special merit by being quite drunk. This last, however, was a detail that did not dawn on my perceptions until too late to cancel the contract. Once he had got me safely fastened inside his rickety, creaky devil wagon, he pulled all the stops all the way out, and went tearing up the crowded boulevard like a comet with a can tied to its tail. I hammered on the glass and begged him to slow down. That is, I hammered on the glass and tried to beg him to slow down. For just such emergencies I had previously stocked up with two French words, doucement and vite. I knew that one of those words meant speed and the other meant less speed, but in the turmoil of the moment I may have confused them slightly. Anyhow, to be on the safe side, I yelled vite a while, and then doucement and vite alternately, and mixed in a few short, simple Anglo-Saxon cuss words and prayers for a dressing. But nothing I said seemed to have the least effect on that demonic scoundrel. Without turning his head he merely shouted back something unintelligible and threw on more juice. On and on we tore, slicing against the sidewalk, curving and jibbing, clattering and careening, now going on 2 wheels and now on 4, while the lunatic shrieked curses of disappointment at the pedestrians who scuttled away to safety from our charging onslaughts, and I held both hands over my mouth to keep my heart from jumping out into my lap. I saw, with instantaneous but photographic distinctness, a lady with a dog tucked under her arm, who hesitated a moment in our very path. She was one of the largest ladies I ever saw, and the dog under her arm was certainly the smallest dog I ever saw. You might say the lady was practically out of dog. I thought we had her and probably her dog too, but she fell back and was saved by a matter of half an inch or so. I think, though, we got some of the buttons off her shirt-waist and the back trimming of her hat. Then there was a rending, tearing crash as we took a fender off a machine just emerging from a cross street. But my lunatic never checked up at all. He just flung a curling ribbon of profanity over his shoulder at the other driver, and bounded onward like a bat out of the bad place. That was the hour when my hair began to turn perceptibly grayer. And yet when by a succession of miracles we had landed intact at my destination, the fiend seemed to think he had done a praiseworthy and creditable thing. I only wish he had been able to understand the things I called him. That is all I wish. It is by a succession of miracles that the members of his maniacal craft usually do dodge death and destruction. The Providence that watches over the mentally deficient has them in its care, I guess, and the same beneficent influence frequently avails to save those who ride behind them and, to a lesser extent, those who walk ahead. Once in a while a Paris cabman does have a lucky stroke and garner in a foot traveller. In an instant a vast and surging crowd convenes. In another instant the road is impassably blocked. Up rushes a gendarme and worms his way through the press to the centre. He has a notebook in his hand. In this book he enters the gloating cabman's name, his age, his address, his wife's maiden name, if any, and gets his views on the Dreyfus case, and finds out what he thinks about the separation of church and state, and tells him that if he keeps on the way he is headed he will be getting the cross of the Legion of Honor pretty soon. They shake hands and embrace, and the cabman cuts another notch in his mudguard, and gets back on the seat and drives on. Then if, by any chance, the victim of the accident still breathes, the gendarme arrests him for interfering with the traffic. It is a lovely system, and sweetly typical. Under the general classification of thrilling moments in the night life of Europe, I should like to list a carriage trip through the outskirts of Naples after dark. In the first place, the carriage driver is an Italian driver, which is a shorter way of saying he is the worst driver living. His idea of getting service out of a horse is, first to snatch him to a standstill by yanking on the bit, and then to force the poor brute into a gallop by lashing at him with a whip having a particularly loud and vixenish cracker on it, and at every occasion to whoop at the top of his voice. In the second place, the street is as narrow as a narrow alley, feebly lighted, and has no sidewalks. And the ruddy paving stones which stretch from house front to house front are crawling with people and goats and dogs and children. Finally, to add zest to the affair, there are lots of loose cows mooning about, for at this hour the cowherd brings his stock to the doors of his patrons. In an Italian city the people get their milk from a cow instead of from a milkman as with us. The milk is delivered on the hoof, so to speak. The grown-ups refuse to make way for you to pass, and the swarming young ones repay you for not killing them by pelting pebbles and less pleasant things into your face. Beggars in all degrees of filth and deformity and repulsiveness run alongside the carriage in imminent danger from the wheels, begging for alms. If you give them something they curse you for not giving them more, and if you give them nothing they spit at you for a base dog of a heretic. But then, what could you naturally expect from a population that thinks fried cuttlefish is edible and beefsteak is not? End of section 28. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 14. That Gay Parensis, Part 1. As you walk along the Rue de la Paix, footnote, the X being one of the few silent things in France, and pay and keep on paying, your eye is constantly engaged by two inscriptions that occur and recur with the utmost frequency. One of these appears in nearly every shop window and over nearly every shop door. It says, "English spoken here." This, I may tell you, is one of the few absolutely truthful and dependable statements encountered by the tourist in the French capital. Invariably English is spoken here. It is spoken here during all the hours of the day and until far into the dusk of the evening, spoken loudly, clearly, distinctly, hopelessly, stridently, hoarsely, despondently, despairingly, and finally profanely, by any Americans who are trying to make somebody round the place understand what they are driving at. The other inscription is carved, painted, or printed on all public buildings, on most monuments, and on many private establishments as well. It is the motto of the French Republic, reading as follows: Liberty, Economy, Frugality. Footnote, free translation. The first word of this, the liberty part, is applicable to the foreigner and is aimed directly at him as a prayer, an injunction and a command, while the rest of it, the economy and the frugality, is competently attended to by the Parisians themselves. The foreigner has only to be sufficiently liberal, and he is assured of a flattering reception wheresoever his straying footsteps may carry him, whether in Paris or in the provinces, but wheresoever those feet of his do carry him he will find a people distinguished by a frugality and inspired by an economy of the frugalest and most economical character conceivable. In the streets of the metropolis he is expected, when going anywhere, to hail the fast-flitting taxicab. Footnote, stops on signal only, and sometimes not then, though the residents patronize the public bus. Indeed, the distinction is made clear to his understanding from the moment he passes the first outlying fortress at the national frontier. Footnote, flag station, since, for the looks of things, if no better reason, he must travel first class on the deluxe trains. Footnote, dinner taken off when you are about half through eating, whereas the Frenchmen pack themselves tightly but frugally into the second class and the third class compartments. Before I went to France I knew Saint Denis was the patron saint of the French, but I did not know exactly why until I heard the legend connected with his death. When the executioner on the hill at Montmartre cut off his head, the good saint picked it up and strolled across the fields with it tucked under his arm. So runs the tale. His head in that shape was no longer of any particular value to him, but your true Parisian is of a saving disposition. And so the Paris population have worshipped Saint Denis ever since. Both as a saint and as a citizen he filled the bill. He would not throw anything away whether he needed it or not. Paris, not the Paris of the art lover, nor the Paris of the lover of history, nor yet again the Paris of the worth-while Parisians, but the Paris which the casual male visitor samples, is the most overrated thing on earth, I reckon, except alligator pear salad, and the most costly. Its system of conduct is predicated, based, organized, and manipulated on the principle that a foreigner with plenty of money and no soul will be along pretty soon. Hence by day and by night the deadfall is rigged and the trap is set and baited with a spurious gaiety and an imitation joyousness, but the joyousness is as thin as one coat of sizing, and the brass shines through the plating, and behind the painted, parted lips of laughter the sharp teeth of greed show in a glittering double row. Yet gallus Mr. Fly, from the USA, walks debonairly in, and out comes Mr. Spider, ably seconded by Madame Spiderette, and between them they despoil him with the utmost dispatch. When he is not being mulcted for large sums, he is being nicked for small ones. It is tip, brother, tip, and keep right on tipping. I heard a story of an American who spent a month in Paris, taking in the sights and being taken in by them, and another month motoring through the country. At length he reached the port whence he was to sail from home. He went aboard the steamer, and saw to it that his belongings were properly stored, and in the privacy of his stateroom he sat down to take an inventory of his letter of credit, now reduced to a wan and wasted spectre of its one plethorific self. In the midst of casting up, he heard the signal for departure, and so he went topside of the ship, and stationing himself on the promenade deck alongside the gangplank, he raised his voice and addressed the assembled multitude on the pier, substantially as follows. If, these were his words, if there is a single solitary individual in this fair land who has not touched me for something of value, if there be in all France a man, woman, or child who has not been tipped by me, let him, her, or it speak now or forever after hold their peace, because, know ye all men by these presents, I am about to go away from here, and if I stay in my right mind I am not coming back. And several persons were badly hurt in the crush, but they were believed afterward to have been repeaters. I thought this story was overdrawn, but after travelling over somewhat the same route which this fellow countryman had taken, I came to the conclusion that it was no exaggeration, but a true bill in all particulars. On the night of our second day in Paris, we went to a theatre to see one of the topical revues, in which Paris is supposed to excel, and for sheer dreariness and blatant vulgarity Paris revues do, indeed, excel anything of a similar nature as done in either England or in America, which is saying quite a mouthful. In the French Revue the members of the chorus reach their artistic limit in costuming when they dance forth from the wings wearing short and shabby undergarments over soiled pink fleshings, and any time the dramatic interest begins to run low and gurgle in the pipes, a male comedian pumps it up again by striking or kicking a woman. But to kick her is regarded as much the more whimsical conceit. This invariably sets the audience rocking with uncontrollable merriment. Howsomever, I am not writing a critique of the merits of the performance. If I were, I should say that to begin with the title of the piece was wrong. It should have been called Lapsus Lingerie, signifying, as the Latins would say, a mere slip. At this moment I am concerned with what happened upon our entrance. At the door, a middle-aged female, who was raising a natty moustache, handed us programs. I paid her for the programs and tipped her. She turned us over to a stout brunette lady who was cultivating a neat and flossy pair of mutton chops. This person escorted us down to the aisle where our seats were, so I tipped her. Alongside our seats stood a third member of the sisterhood, chiefly distinguished from her confrères by the fact that she was turning out something very fetching in the way of a brown Van Dyke, and after we were seated she continued to stand there, holding forth her hand toward me, palm up and fingers extended in the national gesture, and saying something in her native tongue very rapidly. Incidentally, she was blocking the path of a number of people who had come down the aisle immediately behind us. I thought possibly she desired to see our coupons, so I hauled them out and exhibited them. She shook her head at that and gabbled faster than ever. It next occurred to me that perhaps she wanted to furnish us with programs and was asking in advance for the money with which to pay for them. I explained to her that I already secured programs from her friend with the mustache. I did this mainly in English, but partly in French, At least I employed the correct French word for program, which is programme. To prove my case I pulled the 2 programmes from my pocket and showed them to her. She continued to shake her head with great emphasis, babbling on at an increased speed. The situation was beginning to verge on the embarrassing when a light dawned upon me. She wanted a tip. That was it. She had not done anything to earn a tip that I could see, and unless one had been reared in the barbering business she was not particularly attractive to look on, and even then only in a professional aspect. But I tipped her and bade her begone, and straightway she bewent, satisfied and smiling. From that moment on I knew my book. When in doubt I tipped one person, the person nearest to me. When in deep doubt I tipped 2 or more persons, and all was well. On the next evening but one I had another lesson, which gave me further insight into the habits and customs of these gay and gladsome Parisians. We were completing a round of the all-night cafés and cabarets. There were 4 of us. Briefly, we had seen the Dead Rat, the Abbey, the Bal Tabarin, the Red Mill, Maxim's, and the rest of the lot to the total number of perhaps 10 or 12. We had listened to bad singing, looked on bad dancing, sipped gingerly at bad drinks, and nibbled daintily at bad food, and the taste of it all was as grit and ashes in our mouths. We had learnt for ourselves that the much vaunted gay life of Paris was just as sad and sordid and sloppy and unsavoury as the so-called gay life of any other city with a lesser reputation for gay life and gay livers. A scrap of the gristle end of the New York tenderloin, a suggestion of a certain part of New Orleans, a short cross-section of the levee in Chicago, a dab of the Barbary coast of San Francisco in its old, unexpurgated days, a touch of Piccadilly Circus in London after midnight, with a top dressing of Gehenna the Unblessed, it had seemed to us a compound of these ingredients, with a distinctive savour of what was essentially Gallic, permeating through it like garlic through a stew. We had had enough. Even though we had attended only as onlookers and seekers after local colour, we felt that we had a plenty of onlooking and entirely too much of local colour. We felt that we should all go into retreat for a session of self-purification to rid our persons of the one and take a bath in formaldehyde to rinse our memories clean of the other. But the ruling spirit of the expedition pointed out that the evening would not be complete without a stop at a café that had, so he said, an international reputation for its supposed sauciness and its real bohemian atmosphere, whatever that might be. Overcome by his argument, we piled into a cab and departed thither. This particular café was found, in its physical aspects, to be typical of the breed and district. It was small, crowded, overheated, underlighted, and stuffy to suffocation with the mingled aromas of stale drink and cheap perfume. As we entered, a wrangle was going on among a group of young Frenchmen picturesquely attired as art students, almost a sure sign that they were not art students. An undersized girl dressed in a shabby black and yellow frock was doing a Spanish dance on a cleared space in the middle of the floor. We knew her instantly for a Spanish dancer, because she had a fan in one hand and a pair of castanets in the other. Another girl, dressed as a Pierrot, was waiting to do her turn when the Spanish dancer finished. Weariness showed through the lacquer of thick cosmetic on her peaked little face. An orchestra of 3 pieces sawed wood steadily, and at intervals, to prove that these were gay and blithesome revels, somebody connected with the establishment threw small, party-coloured balls of celluloid about. But what particularly caught our attention was the presence in a far corner of 2 little darkies in miniature dress suits, both very wally of eye, very brown of skin, and very shaved as to head, huddled together there as though for the poor comfort of physical contact. As soon as they saw us they left their place and sidled up, tickled beyond measure to behold American faces and hear American voices. End of section 29. Of Europe Revised. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe Revised by Irwin S. Cobb. Chapter 14. That Gay Paresis, Part 2. They belonged, it seemed, to a troupe of Jubilee singers who had been imported from the States for the delectation of French audiences. At night, after their work at a vaudeville theatre was done, the members of their company were paired off and sent about to the cafés to earn their keep by singing ragtime songs and dancing buck dances. These two were desperately, pathetically homesick. One of them blinked back the tears when he told us, with a plaintive African quaver in his voice, how long they had been away from their own country, and how happy they would be to get back to it again. "We sut'nly is glad to hear somebody talkin' the reg'lar United States talk, same as we does," he said. "We gits mighty tired of all dis yere French jabberin'." "Yessah," put in his partner, "dey makes a mighty fuss over coloured folks over here, but 'tain't no ways like home. I comes from Birmingham, Alabama, myself. Does you gentlemen know anybody in Birmingham?" They were the first really wholesome creatures who had crossed our paths that night. They crowded up close to us, and there they stayed until we left, as grateful as a pair of friendly puppies for a word or a look. Presently, though, something happened that made us forget these small dark compatriots of ours. We had had sandwiches all round and a bottle of wine. When the waiter brought the check it fell happily into the hands of the one person in our party who knew French and, what was an even more valuable accomplishment under the present circumstances, knew the intricate French system of computing a bill. He ran a pencil down the figures. Then he consulted the price list on the menu and examined the label on the neck of the wine bottle, and then he gave a long whistle. "What's the trouble?" asked one of us. "Oh, not much," he said. "We had a bottle of wine priced at 18 francs, and they have merely charged us 24 francs for it, 6 francs overcharge on that one item alone. The total for the sandwiches should have been 6 francs, and it is put down at 10 francs. And here, away down at the bottom, I find a mysterious entry of 4 francs, which seems to have no bearing on the case at all, unless it be that they just simply need the money. I expected to be skinned somewhat, but I object to being peeled. I'm afraid, at the risk of appearing mercenary, that we'll have to ask our friend for a recount." He beckoned the waiter to him and fired a volley of rapid French in the waiter's face. The waiter batted his eyes and shrugged his shoulders, then reversing the operation he shrugged his eyelids and batted his shoulder blades, meantime endeavouring volubly to explain. Our friend shoved the check into his hands and waved him away. He was back again in a minute with the amount corrected. That is, it was corrected to the extent that the wine item had been reduced to 21 francs, and the sandwiches to 8 francs. By now our paymaster was hot as a hornet. His gorge rose, his free-born, independent American gorge. It rose clear to the ceiling and threw off sparks and red clinkers. He sent for the manager. The manager came, all bows and graciousness and rumply shirt front, and when he heard what was to be said he became all apologies and indignation. He regretted more than words could tell that the American gentleman who deigned to patronize his restaurant had been put to annoyance. The garçon, here he turned and burned up that individual with a fiery side glance, was a debased idiot and the misbegotten son of yet a greater and still more debased idiot. The cashier was a green hand and an imbecile besides. It was incredible, impossible that the overcharging had been done deliberately, that was inconceivable. But the honour of his establishment was at stake. They should both, garçon and cashier, be discharged on the spot. First, however, he would rectify all mistakes. Would monsieur entrust the miserable addition to him for a moment, for one short moment? Monsieur would, and did. This time the amount was made right, and our friend handed over in payment a 50-franc note. With his own hands the manager brought back the change. Counting it over, the payee found it 5 francs short. Attention being directed to this error, the manager became more apologetic and more explanatory than ever, and supplied the deficiency with a shiny new 5-franc piece from his own pocket. And then, when we had gone away from there and had travelled homeward a mile or two, our friend found that the shiny new 5-franc piece was counterfeit, as false a thing as that manager's false smile. We had bucked the unbeatable system, and we had lost. Earlier that same evening we spent a gloam-laden quarter of an hour in another café, one which owes its fame and most of its American customs to the happy circumstance that in a certain famous comic opera produced a few years ago, a certain popular leading man sang a song extolling its fascinations. The man who wrote the song must have had a full-flowered and glamorous imagination, for he could see beauty where beauty was not. To us there seemed nothing particularly fanciful about the place except the prices they charged for refreshments. However, something unusual did happen there once. It was not premeditated, though. The proprietor had nothing to do with it. Had he known what was about to occur, undoubtedly he would have advertised it in advance and sold tickets for it. By reason of circumstances over which he had no control, but which had mainly to do with a locked-up wardrobe, an American of convivial mentality was in his room at his hotel one evening, fairly consumed with loneliness. Above all things he desired to be abroad amid the life and gaiety of the French capital, but unfortunately he had no clothes except boudoir clothes, and no way of getting any either, which made the situation worse. He had already tried the telephone in a vain effort to communicate with a ready-made clothing establishment in the Rue Saint-Honore. Naturally he had failed, as he knew he would before he tried. Among Europeans the telephone is not the popular and handy adjunct of everyday life it is among us. The English have small use for it because it is, to start with, a wretched Yankee invention. Besides, an Englishman in a hurry takes a cab, as his father did before him, takes the same cab his father took if possible, and the Latin races dislike telephone conversations because all the gestures go to absolute waste. The French telephone resembles a dingus for curling the hair. You wrap it round your head, with one end near your mouth and the other end near your ear, and you yell in it a while, and curse in it a while, and then you slam it down and go send a messenger. The hero of the present tale, however, could not send a messenger. The hotel people had their orders to the contrary from one who was not to be disobeyed. Finally, in stark desperation, maddened by the sounds of sidewalk revelry that filtered up to him intermittently, he encased his feet in bedroom slippers, slid a dressing gown over his pajamas, and negotiated a successful escape from the hotel by means of a rear way. Once in the open, he climbed into a handy cab and was driven to the cafe of his choice, it being the same cafe mentioned a couple of paragraphs ago. Through a side entrance he made a hasty and unhindered entrance into this place, not that he would have been barred under any circumstances, inasmuch as he had brought a roll with him. A person with a cluster of currency on hand is always suitably dressed in Paris, no matter if he has nothing else on, and this man had brought much ready cash with him. He could have gone in fig-leafed like Eve, or fig-leafless like September morn, it being remembered that, as between these two, as popularity depicted, morn wears even less than Eve. So he whisked in handily, and when he had hidden the lower part of himself under a table, he felt quite at home and proceeded to have a large and full evening. Soon there entered another American, and by that mental telepathy which inevitably attracts like spirit to like spirit, he was drawn to the spot where the first American sat. He introduced himself as one feeling the need of congenital companionship, and they shook hands and exchanged names, and the first man asked the second man to be seated, so they sat together and had something together, and then something more together, and as the winged moments flew they grew momentarily more intimate. Finally the newcomer said, "This seems a pretty lachrymose shop. Suppose we go elsewhere and look for some real doings." "Your proposition interests me strangely," said the first man, "but there are two reasons, both good ones, why I may not fare forth with you. Look under the table and you'll see them." The second man looked and comprehended, for he was a married man himself, and he grasped the other's hand in warm and comforting sympathy. "Old man," he said, for they had already reached the old man stage, "don't let that worry you. Why, I've got more pants than any man with only one set of legs has any right to have. I've got pants that have never been warm. You stay right here and don't move until I come back. My hotel is just round the corner from here." No sooner said than done. He went in and in a surprisingly short time was back, bringing spare trousers with him. Beneath the shielding protection of the table draperies the succoured one slipped them on, and they were a perfect fit. Now he was ready to go where adventure might await them. They tarried, though, to finish the last bottle. Over the rim of his glass the second man ventured an opinion on a topic of the day. Instantly the first man challenged him. It seemed to him inconceivable that a person with intelligence enough to have massed so many pairs of trousers should harbour such a delusion. He begged of his new-found friend to withdraw the statement, or at least to abate it. The other man was sorry, but he simply could not do it. He stood ready to concede almost anything else, but on this particular point he was adamant. In fact, adamant was in comparison with him as pliable as chewing taffety. Much as he regretted it, he could not modify his assertion by so much as one brief jot or one small tittle, without violating the consistent principles of a consistent life. He felt that way about it. All his family felt that way about it. "Then, sir," said the first man with rare dignity, "I regret to wound your feelings, but my sensibilities are such that I cannot accept, even temporarily, the use of a pair of trousers from the loan collection of a person who entertains such false and erroneous conceptions. I have the pleasure, sir, of wishing you good night." With these words he shucked off the borrowed habiliments and slammed them into the abashed bosom of the obstinate stranger and went back to his captivity. Pantsless, it is true, but with his honour unimpaired. End of section 30.